Keeper of the Lost Cities, Exile, Book 2, Chapter 2. Sophie's gasp echoed off the circle of trees, and she blinked to make sure her eyes were working. A few feet in front of her stood a shimmering pale horse with outstretched feathered wings. It wasn't a Pegasus. She knew from the books she'd studied at Havenfield that those were smaller and huskier, with deep blue spots and midnight blue manes. This horse had wavy silver hair that trailed up its neck and parted around a horn of swirled white and silver that jutted from its forehead like a unicorn. But the unicorns she'd seen didn't have wings. "What are you?" Sophie whispered, as she stared into the horse's deep brown eyes. Usually she thought brown eyes were flat and boring, especially her own, but these had glinting flecks of gold and gazed back at her so intently she couldn't look away. The horse whinnied. "It's okay, I won't hurt you." Sophie transmitted images of herself caring for other animals. The horse stamped its hooves and nickered, but stayed put, eyeing Sophie warily. Sophie focused on its thoughts, searching for anything she could use to make it trust her. The complexity of its mind was shocking. She could feel rapid observations and quick calculations, just like when she was reading an elven mind. And the emotions were so intense. Now she knew how empaths must feel, and she was glad she wasn't one of them. It was hard to know which feelings were hers. "There you are," Dex said, stomping into the clearing. His jaw fell open as the horse whinnied and took to the sky. "It's okay," Sophie called. "He's a friend." Friend. As soon as she transmitted the word, the horse froze, hovering above them. Dozens of images flashed through Sophie's head. Then a new emotion nearly choked her. Her eyes burned and her heart ached. It took her a second to translate the feeling. "You're lonely," Sophie whispered. "That's not a Sasquatch," Dex mumbled. "Yeah, I caught that," Sophie told him. "Do you know what it is?" "An alicorn," Grady murmured behind her, triggering a new wave of panic from the flying horse. "Another friend," Sophie transmitted as it soared higher into the clouds. Grady was actually more than a friend. He was her adopted father, but for some reason she had a hard time calling him that, even with her adopting being final now. "It's okay," she promised the alicorn. "No one is going to hurt you." The alicorn whinnied, its mind focused on Sandor and the weapon at Sandor's side. "Sandor, you're scaring it. You need to get back." Sandor didn't budge. "Please," Grady told him. "We can't lose this creature. You know how essential it is to our world." Sandor sighed and stormed out of the clearing, grumbling about it being impossible to do his job. "This horse is really that important?" Sophie asked, squinting at the sky. Yeah." Dex's voice was annoyingly smug. "They've only found one ever. The council's been searching for another for centuries." "Millennia," Grady corrected. "Throughout our time on this planet, we've worked to discover all its secrets. And then by accident, really, a magnificent alicorn stumbled into our lives, proving the Earth still had a few tricks up its sleeves. We've been trying to find another ever since. We can't let it slip away. Can you call it down to us, Sophie?" The pressure of his request sat heavy on her shoulders as she promised to try. "Safe," she transmitted to the terrified creature, adding images of her caring for other animals to try and reinforce the word. Then she sent a picture of the alicorn standing next to her in the clearing. "Come down," When the alicorn didn't respond, she added an image of how she would look if she was stroking the alicorn's shimmering mane. A rush of loneliness poured over her again, stronger this time, an ancient feeling ached. Then the alicorn circled once more and landed just out of Sophie's reach. Incredible, Grady breathed. Good girl, Sophie whispered. Girl? Dex asked. Sophie nodded, wondering how she knew that. It almost felt like the alicorn had told her. The alicorn at the sanctuary is male, Grady said, snapping her out of her musings. This is the find of a lifetime, Sophie. Sophie grinned, imagining the look on Counselor Bronte's face when he heard the news. He despised her human upbringing and her connection to the Black Swan, a secret group of rebels who seemed to be behind every mystery in Sophie's past, and was always trying to prove she didn't belong in their world. Not to kill everyone's excitement here, Dex interrupted, but how are we going to get home? Grady's smile faded. That's a good question. The Sasquatch harness won't fit, and even if I dashed home, it's not like we have an alicorn restraint. Maybe we don't need one. Sophie stared into the alicorn's unblinking eyes and transmitted friend again. Then she reached out her hand and took a slow step forward. Careful, Grady warned when the alicorn whinnied. Easy, girl, Sophie whispered, not breaking eye contact as she took another step. Calm. She sent a flood of images of her petting different animals, trying to communicate that she was about to do. The alicorn processed each scene, focusing on Sophie. She nickered. Sophie hoped that meant, go ahead. She held her breath and closed the last space between them. Her fingers brushed the smooth, cool fur on the bridge of the alicorn's nose. The shimmering horse snorted but didn't back away. Good girl, Sophie said, tracing her fingers up towards the horn. She fingered the strands of silvery mane, surprised at how cold they were, like threads of ice. The alicorn released what sounded like a soft sigh, and she nuzzled Sophie's shoulder. Sophie giggled as the wet nostrils tickled her neck. She likes you, Grady whispered. Is that true, girl? Do you like me? A shiver streaked down Sophie's spine as something trickled her consciousness. The longer it bounced around her mind, the more it took shape until it formed a single word. Friend. What's wrong? Grady asked, as Sophie took a step away, shaking her head. Sorry, I'm just not used to how powerful her mind is. She stroked the horse's gleaming cheek, trying to make sense of what just happened. Had the alicorn learned a word from her? Was that possible? Think she'll let me touch her? Grady asked, taking a cautious step forward. The alicorn reared and flapped her wings. Grady backed off. That's going to be a problem. In order to light leap with the alicorn, someone would need to keep physical contact with her to form a connection between them. I can leap her, Sophie offered. Absolutely not! Grady's shout made the alicorn whinny, and he lowered his tone to a whisper before he added, That's far too dangerous. I can handle it, Sophie insisted. All the excitement had erased both her headache and her weariness from the brain push. Remember what happened last time? Dex interrupted. Sophie glared at him, stunned he was siding with Grady on this. Hey, don't look at me like that. You almost faded away. His voice caught as he said the last part. and Sophie couldn't help wondering how much Dex had seen that day. She thought he was unconscious when she made the nearly fatal leap to escape the kidnappers, but apparently he'd watched the light pull her way. At least that's what Elvin had told her. She and Dex had never talked about what happened. All Sophie remembered was warmth and flashing colors and a pull so irresistible she'd been ready to follow it anywhere, and nearly had. She'd never forget the agony of drawing herself back together, and now whenever she leaped, she felt slightly dizzy. But the dizziness only lasted a few seconds, and in all the times Elvin had tested her since, she'd recovered. He'd never found anything wrong. Plus, all of that happened before she knew how to use enhanced concentration, before she even knew her concentration had been enhanced. Not to mention, the kidnappers had taken her nexus. She cupped the sleek black cuff on her wrist, fingering the sparkly teal jewel set into the center, surrounding by swirling lines of diamonds. Nexus put a force field around her, making it impossible for her to lose even a single particle of herself during a leap, which meant she could use her concentration to protect the Alcon and leap them both home safely. It made sense in her head, but she couldn't fight off a tiny shiver at the idea of another risky leap. "We don't have any other options," Sophie said, as much for herself as to convince Grady and Dex. "Unless there's something I'm missing?" When no one had any other suggestions, she took a deep breath and imagined her concentration covering the glittering horse like a protective seal. Her headache returned, and she had to channel the last of her core energy to cover such a large creature, but she scraped together enough strength to feel a firm grip. She could do this. Before she could change her mind, she placed one hand on the alicorn's cheek and used the other to grab the pendant hanging from a long chain around her neck. She held the crystal up, and light hit the single facet, cut into stone, refracting toward the ground. "Sophie, don't you—" Grady started to say, but he was too late. She stepped into the light, letting the warmth swell under her skin like thousands of trickling feathers as the simmering rush swept her and the alicorn away.